I'm going to be with you for about 20 minutes. Delighted to be here. I'm going to talk to you about something that's slightly different from probably most of what you've heard here, and I'm going to talk to you about it from a slightly different lens. So my current role is I've just joined Teads about 6 months ago as Global VP of Client Partnerships. What that means is basically my job is to step change the growth of the Teads business, and if we step change the growth of the Teads business, we'll be chucking a lot more demand publisher away, so that should be a win-win for everybody. But before that, my last 25 years have always been client-side, and the last 6 years I was a global media director of Mars Chocolate. So I'm going to talk about stuff that I think is really important, which is the importance of content and the importance of the impact content can have on effectiveness, what we're trying to do about it, which should help the publisher networks become much more effective and attractive to advertisers. So I think the most important thing, oops, the title's disappeared from there, but the most important thing for everybody in this room to remember is, why do advertisers spend money on advertising? And the reason they do that is to drive growth. And if it doesn't drive growth, advertising becomes a cost. And if advertising is a cost, the first thing that big businesses do is they cut it. Okay? So wherever you are in the ecosystem and everything that the publishers and stuff should be doing, is this going to help advertisers drive growth? And if it does, they will spend more money on you. And the discussion here was really interesting, actually. And it was the same when I was on the client side, and we get incredibly navel-gazing at these kind of things. But actually, the reality is there is no God-given right, but if you do a brilliant job, the money will come. From my perspective, there are three key factors that drive media impact. The first is reach. Okay, so the broader the reach, and the reach can either be, if you're something like chocolate, our target market was anyone with a mouth, so it's kind of like everybody. Okay? If you're in pet care, your target is anybody who's got a dog or anybody who's got a cat. So it's about making sure you've got the right reach, but the ambition is, how do you get and reach as broad an audience as possible? The second really important factor, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, which is content, is you can have fantastic reach, but if your content is rubbish, the money you're spending on the reach is absolutely useless. And the third element in terms of media impact comes from context, and that is, I think, an area that a lot of brands and media directors have forgotten the importance of context, and I think it is an area where publishers have a tremendous opportunity, and it's one of the messages that I'm taking back to clients at the moment, that, again, you can have fantastic reach, you can have fantastic content, but if the context is poor, then actually all of your money is wasted. So an example, when I was on Mars, I took a whole load of money out of Facebook. Why? Because you don't build brand stories in 1 or 2 seconds. If you think about the luxury channels, you can have fantastic reach and fantastic content, but if you're being used to wrap up in a beautiful double-page spread, being used to wrap up fish and chips, and again, that is not where you want your brands to appear. So the context is really, really important. But coming back to content, content is king. And, and 2/3 of media effectiveness we used to analyze at Mars came from the quality of the content. And that's why it's really, really important that the content is good. And it's really, really important for everybody. It's important for the advertisers, because the better the content is, the more they'll sell. It's really important for the users, because then they don't see shitty advertising. It's really important for the publishers, because if the user's happy because they're not seeing crap advertising on your site, then they'll come back and they won't be complaining. And from our perspective at Teads, because essentially we're a business that operates on a cost per completed view, the worst thing for us is poor quality content, because poor quality content means we have to give lots of impressions away and we lose money as a result. But the big challenge is how do you know whether your content is any good or bad? And that has always been a challenge in advertising. And it's why it's really, really important. And the analogy that I use when I'm talking to clients at the moment is, if you're going to jump out of a plane, surely you want to know before you jump, rather than after you jump, that your parachute's going to open, which kind of sounds blindingly obvious. But then if you look at the amount of money that is spent, and I find it really interesting, having left Mars and talked to a lot of very big businesses, the lack of time that they're either spending money in pre-testing or post-testing is absolutely criminal, because if you go back to the quality of the content drives the effectiveness, it is really important that you know. And it's really important that you know before rather than after, because post-testing is great, but you've then gone and spent the money. So you're 6 months down the road and you found you've spent $250,000, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, $10 million on stuff that's absolutely rubbish. So one of the things that I'm really trying to get people to really think about is how do they improve the quality of their pre-testing, which is what we talked about there. So, and therefore what we've introduced at Teads is what we're calling the Teads Creative Lab, which we are offering to all of our clients to use on the content that they're going to put on your sites, on the publisher sites, which will then make the impact of their advertising spend much, much more effective. So there are 3 very quick steps that we're doing. The first step that we're doing is we're running that content through 50,000 impressions, so roughly 50,000 people. And then we're measuring that against the database of every single bit of content we've ever run on any publisher site. So we can tell clients very, very quickly, is the ad or the piece of content that they're running in the top 5 to 10% of content we've ever run? And if it's in the top 5 to 10%, that means more people are watching it to the end than is the norm, which very simplistically means there's something in that content that's quite engaging. Otherwise, people wouldn't be watching it that way. The second thing we're getting them to do, or the second thing we tell them is it in the bottom 3 to 5%? So if we're finding, and we can tell second by second, that nobody's watching past second 3, that's a very good indication that that's actually not a good piece of content. And we're also using it to help them judge if they've got 2 or 3 bits of content and they don't know which one to run. Because if you've got one that's got a 25% completion rate, one that's got a 20% completion rate, and one's got a 2 or 3% completion rate, again, it's a pretty good indication whether that content is any good or bad. So that's the first thing that we're doing. The second thing that we're doing is we've just partnered up with one of the world's leading facial coding companies. And who knows what facial coding is? Just stick your hands up so I know roughly what. Okay, very simplistically, the way that this works is what it does is it measures through your facial reactions what's actually happening when you see an ad. Okay? So in the past, what used to happen is they used to show you an ad and say, right, what do you think about the ad? Do you like that ad? Is it any good? Was the dress any good? And you sort of write all that down. And the problem with that is it takes you out from what is a very emotional state.
For measuring how people feel as they view video content. When people watch video at home or on the move, we collect their subconscious emotional responses by simply sharing their webcam. Test any demographic, anywhere in the world, and get insights from all of those responses in one simple dashboard. You can see, second by second, exactly how your audience feels about your video content. Whether it's a single video or entire campaign, you can view the highs and lows of your content's performance.
Should have been content's performance. So ultimately what it's doing is measuring your face as you're watching an ad and then showing the reaction to that.
Excuse me, if anybody would be more interested, I'm a product manager that realizes exactly that product, so after the presentation, please reach out.
Fantastic. So we can have a quick chat afterwards. But it's a really, really important point because the next bit then is in terms of, so what you get, what has happened with this? Can you go back to the next slide, please, whoever's up there? Right, brilliant. So can you play the video on this as well? Hopefully you can play the video on this. But essentially what you get through here then is you get a second by second read of what is emotionally going on with the consumer. And even if they can't play the video, it doesn't matter, we'll show a trace. So you can see that it starts off quite low. Oh, perfect, we got it again. Good. So if you see the ad going on the left-hand side, and you can see second by second a summary of all the emotions everyone's watching as they see this ad. So it's an ad about a whole lot of dogs doing something, not a lot of engagement, goes up a bit as they go running out the store, comes back down, and at the end you get a peak when the dogs are trying to buy the Doritos. Now what's quite interesting is if I just look at the faces, you go from at the start, which is it's quite boring, to actually you see the smiles come up that actually show you exactly what's going on. This, and we did a lot of work at this when I was at Mars, and what Mars used to do was they used to measure the sales impact of every bit of content they used to put on, essentially on TV, and from an actual sales perspective. And we gave 150 ads to this company, Realize, across 5 countries, and got them to run it through their facial coding tracking system. And they had a 75% correlation between what they predicted and what we actually knew were the sales outtakes in terms of was it a good ad or a bad ad. And to put that in context, Ipsos pre-testing, which is a lot more expensive, takes a lot more time, is about 66%. But we used to run internally at Mars for anyone who was doing either advertising or media, a kind of internal test, a bit like this, to say they knew what the results were, and they used to ask us to predict what the scores were based on our understanding of media or advertising. And mine was 62%, which is not to make you feel really sorry for me that I'm really bad at judging advertising, but if I've worked for 25 years in companies like Nestle, Kimberly-Clark, Mars, on making ads with some of the best companies, and I've got a 60% success rate in predicting good ads, imagine what you're like if you're a junior brand manager in country ABC. So expecting people to be great at judging copy, unfortunately, just doesn't really happen, and therefore giving yourself some tools to ensure the copy quality is better becomes really, really important. The other thing that's really important is you get a few things that go on here. You get an emotional score, so an overall score, which is it any good or not? So 9 out of 10 is really good, 1 out of 10 is pretty rubbish for pretty obvious reasons. And then you get the first 2 scores, which is how is it performing from an attraction at the start and keeping people, and then you've got what's happening from an engagement and an impact perspective. But the really interesting thing is, and why we do the first bit, which is the view-through rates, is if you take an ad like that, at the end, it's fantastically engaging. But if you overlay the view-through rates and you see that 95% of people don't get to the good bit, then you've got a problem. And actually, that's where we then come in with we've got an in-house studio that can come in and make some specific recommendations on how to improve the ads. So a couple of examples. This would be, nothing's going on here. No, we're going forward, not backwards. Can we keep going forward? Yeah, great. So in this example, you can see the shape of the ad that starts, gets to a certain point at 7 seconds and starts to drop off. And actually, if that ad were to play, what you'd see, if that ad were to play up there, what you would see is that there's no branding till second 20. So essentially, one of the things you might bring in is either some branding much earlier on, a call to action like discover more, or this is an EY example in terms of building the better branding. What we found is if we really look very closely at what's going on from view-through rate, what's actually going from a facial coding, we can increase the likely or the amount of time that people are spending on that ad by up to 50%. And why that becomes really important is because if we are working on the quality of the content, which means that when they go on your publisher site, ABC, they're getting a much bigger uplift than actually, again, coming back to start bit, everybody's winning. Oh, that's the thing. The other thing we're also using it to help brands with is to decide which copy to run again. So in this example, you can see that video A is great, video B is okay, video C and D are not very good. So in that case, we're telling them not to run the poor copy on those sites, and also to think about copy rotation. So you might think about running 70% on video A and 30% on video B, for example. So, and the final thing that we're doing is we're turning all of that around within 10 working days. So putting some real pace behind it to enable them to make decisions that even if you've got a 4-week campaign can start to affect the second 2 weeks of the campaign, and over time starting to build their learning and understanding of what makes good content or not. And what we're trying to do, and this is a bit of a challenge in my business, to try and get people to actually turn around to clients and say, look, this is not very good content, you should not even run it at all, versus we'll just take the money. But longer term, that is also how we add real value and trust to those clients and make sure that everyone in that ecosystem, from the advertiser to the user to the publisher and ultimately us, benefit from a world where content is better. So the overall macro point, and that wasn't to say, come and do creative lab testing with Teads, but I think the macro point that's really, really important is that advertisers spend money to drive growth. It is really, really important that for wherever they are putting their money, it's working as hard as possible. We're working really hard to make sure that does, which hopefully you from a publisher perspective will start to reap the benefits of as we are starting to accelerate our growth in a global market. And that is very simplistically what we're trying to do, and why content is really, really important, and why you should all be making sure, wherever you sit in the ecosystem, that you're doing every single thing you can to make sure the quality of the content is as good as possible. Now you can have your lunch.